Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Many moons ago, when the buffalo roamed and I was in middle school, we had to take part in an accelerated reader program. Perhaps you went through it, or you remember your kids participating in it. You had to earn so many points per month or quarter or something like that, and every book was worth a certain number of points. I remember doing the calculus and figuring out that if I read the typical book that a 7th grader reads, I would have to read something like 2 books a month to meet my goals, and that just seemed like a hassle to me. So I looked at the catalog to see what books could get me more points, so I would only have to read 1 book per period, and that's when I discovered Lord of the Rings. Each of the 3 books was worth enough points so that if all I read that year was that trilogy, I'd meet my point objectives. That's all I needed to know, so I checked the first book out from the library and got started. Little did I know that I was reading 3 of the best books that I would ever read. Those books, and then later when I picked up The Hobbit, were the only books that I ever pretended to go to sleep, only to use a flashlight under the covers to keep reading. I remember the strange elvish script written on the cover of the book that left you with the sense of an entire world yet to be discovered. I had that same feeling the first time I came across a non-indexed handwritten document in my family history research. It was a will written at the beginning of the 19th century, and when I first looked at it, it might as well have been written in Elvish. It was a poor quality digitized microfilm, and I wasn't sure whether it was the poor quality of the image or the foreign handwriting that made it harder to decipher. As I fiddled with the brightness and contrast and fiddled with inverting the colors, I felt like I was slowly starting to recognize words. There was a story to be uncovered in that document, but I just couldn't quite get to it. The longer I sat there staring at the chicken scratch, the more words started to pop out for me. Each of those words built context for understanding the rest, and before you knew it, I could read the whole document. Perhaps you've already had this experience, or perhaps you're still at the stage where it looks like it's written in Elvish. But reading old handwriting is a skill that you're going to have to acquire if you want to be serious about understanding your family history. The typewriter wasn't invented until the mid-19th century, and although the printing press predates it by a good 400 years, prior to the typewriter, prepared printed documents were rare. So if you want to understand your family before the 1860s or so, you're going to need to get comfortable with paleography, or the deciphering of old handwritten scripts. When dealing with English handwriting, when doing genealogy, you'll usually encounter 4 main hands, or types of handwriting. By far the most common I've come across is known as roundhand. But styles of roundhand vary widely over time, and of course you'll always have to contend with the neatness of the individual who wrote what you're looking at. Some of the other hands that you might encounter are known as court, secretary, and italic. Courthand is very old, so if you've come across it, you've either done quite well in your genealogical research, or you're just lucky enough to have encountered a scribe who was cute and wanted to be a bit more formal. The downside of courthand is that it's exceptionally hard to read without studying it. The upside is that once you've studied it, it's a very regular and rigidly formatted hand, so you likely won't have to deal with as much major variances within a document or from scribe to scribe. With that said, I've never found myself having to read it for genealogy myself, but I've looked at plenty of it, and it mostly just looks like a foreign language. Honestly, if you're reading something in courthand, it may in fact be a foreign language, as many documents of that era in handwriting are written in Latin, French, or possibly early modern or even Middle English. Secretary hand developed after courthand, coming into popularity in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's more of a flowing, cursive-looking hand than compared to courthand. You'll often find more variation in letter formations from writer to writer, and even within a single document, which can make it a bit harder to read. However, the letters do look significantly more recognizable to the modern reader than with courthand. It does have a lot of flourishes. I'll link to a BYU handwriting tutorial that has a document that shows all the various ways that each character might be written in secretary hand. This is useful to print out and keep next to you if you're trying to decipher a document written in this style. Italic hand is where you can take a breath and relax a bit. It was most popular in the 18th century, and while not immediately fully recognizable by a modern reader, with very little experience you can start reading it pretty easily. It does still have some oddities of older style handwriting, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. One of the great challenges with italic hand, though, is that this is an era where you'll get drastically different takes on the style from one writer to the next. Finally, roundhand is the style of handwriting that you might say has just gone out of style within the last decade or so, and we call it cursive. Like I said before, there are various styles of roundhand as you look at it through the years, and older versions will still sometimes use archaic letterforms, but documents written in this hand are very readable, provided you have at least a decent scan to work with. If you find yourself looking at an original, as long as you can read cursive, you'll likely find the document fairly simple to read. I perhaps make it sound a bit too easy, though, because anyone who's done any amount of genealogy has found themselves staring blankly at a handwritten page, unsure of where to start. Here are some tips when dealing with a handwritten document that's particularly challenging to decipher. A large number of the roundhand documents you'll be looking at will be, say, at least 20% readable without any effort. Use this 20% as your basis for understanding the rest. You'll likely be able to understand enough to give you some context. Just like you used context clues when you were first learning to read, you should do the same thing when reading old handwritten documents. Here's an example. You're looking at a will and you're struggling with a few words. Say you can read the following phrase: I, George Raymond, being blank in body, but of blank mind and blank. Well, using context clues, the first blank referring to his physical health is probably the word weak or infirm or something like that. The second blank, assuming this is a legal will, should be the word sound. And the last blank is probably memory. You can build additional context in this particular example by looking at other wills from the same time and location. Wills usually have fairly prescriptive formats and might vary from place to place, but are usually pretty consistent within a single location and time period. Once you have a good idea of the boilerplate portion of the document, you can quickly see that boilerplate in each subsequent document you look at. The nice thing about wills is that while the format does change over time, and from one location to another, the boilerplate text is pretty common among them all. So once you've gotten a few under your belt, it starts getting substantially easier. Let's look at a different sentence that you might find in the same will that could be a bit more challenging. Item 1. I give, devise, and bequeath to my daughter, blank blank, and the heirs of her body 50 acres of land originally granted to blank blank. Your usual context clues method isn't going to work here, but you can use a kind of context clue to help you. My handwriting varies a bit over the course of an entire handwritten page, but the structure and style of individual characters is fairly consistent. My words might get smaller or start to lean to the right a bit, loops might get tighter, but I'm generally not going to go from having the stem of my D's curl to the left to having them curl to the right. Most people are the same way and have been the same way for a long time, so as you come across names in particular, if you're struggling to decipher them, try to look at each individual character and then look through the document for other shapes that look the same. You might not be able to figure out each character of the name, but you'll probably find enough of them to figure out what the name is. This brings me to a tip that I've picked up myself only recently. I learned this at this year's Roots Tech. If you're dealing with a particularly challenging document, try building an alphabet in the hand of the scribe. Download the document and open it in an image editor. Copy each letter that you can recognize and paste it into another document. I really like OneNote for stuff like this. So I'd look for an A, preferably both upper and lowercase, but you may not find both of each character. I'd paste it into my OneNote, and then next to the image I would put a typed A. Complete as much of the alphabet as you can, but accept that you may not get all the way from A through Z. You can then use that as a guide. As you read through the document and encounter words that you struggle with, look back at your character reference to get a sense of what the word might be. Sometimes the scans that you'll be looking at are going to be pretty low quality. They might be too light or too dark. Maybe you're looking at a scan of a paper that was written on both sides, and part of the text from the back of the page is seeping through and making what you're looking at hard to read. That's where using some of the image manipulation tools available on many of the research sites can come in useful. Fiddle with the brightness, the contrast, hue and saturation, and you can sometimes significantly increase the readability of the document. If you have software like Photoshop or CorelDRAW or Affinity Photo, or even a free tool like GIMP, you can try adding a layer on top of the document that you're reading, and then trace over the characters in a thinner line. Once you've traced a few words, try hiding the document to only look at your traced layer, and that can sometimes help since thick nibs or quills can sometimes influence the readability. Understand that the way every character in the English language has been written has not always been consistent. One that often trips up beginning genealogists is the letter S. In many documents, dating from the early 19th century on back to the 17th century and earlier, single S characters and the first S in double S pairs would be written as a long S. A long S can look almost indistinguishable from an F. J's and G's can often be confused, and V's and R's can look surprisingly similar. A lot of this can be figured out simply by using context and saying that although it may look like an F, it couldn't be because that doesn't make a word. But if you're dealing with a particularly stylized hand, it can really be worth your time to just study the hand and look at other documents written in that hand if you can. Usually that can be accomplished by simply looking at the pages left and right in whatever set of images you're looking at. In particularly old documents, you might stumble upon a thorn. The thorn often looks like a lowercase p with a long stem rising from above the rounded part of the character. But in later documents, it was often substituted with what looks like a lowercase y. This was because most printing presses didn't have the thorn character, but this was sometimes copied into handwritten documents as well. The thorn character makes the th sound, which is where we get the erroneous idea of ye old shop and stuff like that. No one ever said ye, it was the, and it was pronounced the. It's just that when the y replaced the thorn character, things started to get confused. There are other archaic characters that you can stumble across, like the win, eth, ash, and ethel, but I'd say that if you're needing to read documents with these characters in them, you're doing great and you don't need my help anymore. Manually transcribing documents is a great practice to get into. If you're like me, you'll want to move fast. You just want to get in there, get the information you're looking for, and keep going. You want to read the document and just move on. Unfortunately, once you find yourself looking at a lot of handwritten documents, you really need to slow down. Try opening up a document and just typing out what you see. Slowly work your way through with the techniques that I've mentioned, and if a word that you've figured out doesn't make sense in context, try a different word. Typing the document out can really help with context checking, and once you've done it, you'll never have to struggle with that document again because you've already transcribed it. Once you get away from the safety of typewritten documents and start venturing into the truly challenging script of 18th century handwritten documents, you can truly start calling yourself a genealogist. If you're venturing into this territory, be proud of yourself. You're doing things that not just anyone has the ability to do. Once you've got some experience with it, you'll find yourself reading page after page of what looks to others like impenetrable elvish script. Don't get discouraged if you really do get stuck, though. We all do. And sharing a screenshot of a particularly challenging document on Facebook or the right circles of Twitter can get you a good bit of help. If you've found a document that you're struggling to read, feel free to contact me on Twitter at the WGTPod. I'm happy to help. If I can't read it, I'll point you in the direction of others more skilled than me. If you've enjoyed these tips, think about leaving a review. Either way, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.